Welcome to the Homeless Conservative, a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I'm Blake Fisher. I'm one of those citizens, but I'm also a political junkie, so you don't have to be necessarily. I know you have a lot of things competing for your attention, so let's get into what mattered this week. It would be hard to argue that Russia was not tangled in everything that mattered this week. First, we're going to talk about Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin and his bizarre sort of gushing about Russian grocery stores and Subways and McDonald's. Subways, the transit things, not the bad sandwich shop, not to be confused with the McDonald's sentence. And then, none of that would usually grab headlines in a run-of-the-mill week, but then Putin's loudest critic, Alexei Navaldy, already locked away in a bleak Siberian prison camp beyond the Arctic Circle. He died suddenly. And we're left to read between the lines because you know how it goes. When you hear hoofbeats, you expect horses, not zebras. Well, in Putin's world, if an outspoken critic of him dies, you expect assassination, not death by natural causes. Even though that's what Russia is claiming, no one's buying it. And that wasn't all. We'll get into the potential threat of Russian nuclear weapons in space. This was a new thing that came out this week. And the forever delayed Ukraine support funding bills in Congress. And finally, we'll talk about why all this has turned the new right into a truly anti-American party. It's a strange place to be in the world right now. So let's get into it. Tucker, first of all, someone that I wouldn't normally talk about. I don't spend a lot of time critiquing media on here because, I don't know. I mean, I think it's important to talk about why the most influential people on the right are sometimes full of crap, because that's where I'm coming from. This is not to say that there aren't the same number of people full of crap on the left in the left media, but we expect that of most media. We expect there to be a liberal bias in media because there is, and anyone that claims otherwise is not paying attention. But there is also a weird bias on the right where everyone's gone all in on basically kowtowing to Trump, and sometimes that gets people in trouble. For example, it got Tucker fired sort of from Fox News because his sort of stolen election stuff got them sued. And, they lost I think they settled for $750 something billion. There was also some sort of sexual harassment suit or some sort of harassment suit that he was apparently part of too. So he was just costing the network way too much money and they fired him. And so he's now in his own little world. And generally when this happened at Fox News several times. It happened with Bill O'Reilly and his sort of sexual harassment stuff. And it's happened with Glenn Beck. It's happened with Tucker now. Like these people that think they're maybe bigger than the network. And then the network says, nah, you're really not. And they let him go. I don't really pay much attention to Tucker. I think he's a very smart guy. I think he used to be a pretty good TV personality for conservatives, especially I know Jon Stewart loved to give them crap. And there's that famous thing. But like Crossfire, I think was a decent show. It had smart conservative, smart liberal arguing back and forth. And for as much as Jon Stewart claimed that was what was ruining America, I would love to see a liberal and a conservative get on TV right now and argue about stuff. I'd love to see that. No, we're not seeing that anymore. Now it's echo chambers. There's no fair and balanced at Fox anymore. They don't have liberals on to talk about stuff and argue counterpoints. They don't even have people that don't follow their specific version of conservatism. So I would take that. And I think Tucker's a smart guy, but I think he's lost his way. And this Putin interview and the content that came along with it is kind of proof of that. And just to show you where he's sort of fallen and how influential he is, at the height of Tucker's show, he was drawing in more viewers on cable news than anyone else. He had like 3 million a night. That sounds big. It's really not crazy. That's 1% of the country, or less than 1% of the country. And people like Joe Rogan have like 4 times that audience on a daily basis. So, we think of cable news as sort of this behemoth, but really in the grand scheme of things, it's not like there's that many people watching him. But I do think he had unique influence on sort of conservative politics in general, just as sort of, that might've been how many people actually sit there and turn the TV on, but it doesn't mean clips and doesn't mean those people don't influence things. So I think he had a pretty big influence on conservative politics, but he kind of went along with the Trump populism stuff. And now he's really gone all in on that. And it's hard to know what is real because I do think some of it is shtick. I mean, I think with any of these people that you see on TV talking about politics, there's a certain degree of what does my audience want to hear? And that's what I'm going to say to them. There's a degree of that for sure. I don't think it's that they're always driving the conversation in the way that they think it should go. I think a lot of times they're following, they're not really leading. And it's hard to know I think at some point it was kind of a grift. It was just, he's kind of changed. He was a little more libertarian back in the day, sort of spoke about, corruption and things like that. And now it seems like he's just all in on the populism thing and kind of asking the important questions about, sort of being, I think, plainly kind of un-American, which we'll get to. But, so he goes to interview Putin in Russia, and he does this 2-hour unedited interview, which, I tried to get through. It's hard because there's a translator on Putin. He's got that stupid thing on his ear. I'm like, can we not get him a smaller earpiece for a translation? I'm curious why it has to be that thing. And it's 2 hours long, and it's honestly just Putin rambling about the history of Russia, a lot of which is not true. I mean, he claims things like that Poland was responsible for starting World War II because they didn't give part of their territory to Germany, so Germany invaded, which is his justification for Ukraine. I mean, that's why he's blaming Poland for World War II. But so you can't even trust the history, and it's basically just Putin rambling for 2 hours. Tucker hardly gets a word in edgewise. I've not actually finished the whole thing because it's that boring. So anyway, and it's just nonsense. It's like he's not really asking any hard questions. And but then he had these like 3 little shorts where he, I don't know, they're just sort of these fun things, I guess, where he like went to a Russian grocery store and he traveled through the subway stations and went to the not McDonald's anymore because after the sanctions and stuff, it's now like some, other version of McDonald's, but it's McDonald's, just the Russian version of it. To be like, look, it's the same. It was a really bizarre sort of thing. So he goes to a grocery store specifically. I think this is more interesting than the interview, honestly, is these little clips, because I think they kind of get you into his mindset. So he goes to this grocery store and, let's just play. I've got a clip of it. So let's go here.
So we thought it would be interesting to take a look at a contemporary, modern-day, 2024 Russian grocery store 2 years into sanctions. Here we go. All right. There we go. So I guess you put in 10 rubles here and you get it back when you put the cart back. So it's free, but there's an incentive to return it and not just bring it to your homeless encampment. I went from amused to legitimately angry. So we were guessing what this would cost. Everybody hears from the United States buys groceries, and we didn't pay any attention to costs as we were just putting in the cart what we would actually eat over a week. And we all came in around $400, about $400. It was $104 US here. And that's when you start to realize that ideology maybe doesn't matter as much as you thought. Corruption. If you take people's standard of living and you tank it through filth and crime and inflation, and they literally can't buy the groceries they want, at that point, maybe it matters less what you say or whether you're a good person or a bad person. You're wrecking people's lives in their country, and that's what our leaders have done to us. And coming to a Russian grocery store, the heart of evil, and seeing what things cost and how people live, it will radicalize you against our leaders. That's how I feel anyway, radicalized. We're not making any of this up, by the way, at all.
We're not making any of it up. We're just leaving a lot out of the story. Tucker claims to be a journalist, which is hilarious to me because it doesn't take much to figure out that like all of this is sort of a facade. First of all, the grocery store is a French-run grocery store, so it's not even Russian-ran. So there's one thing. Secondly, $100 in US dollars. Let me teach Tucker a little bit about economics. Our dollar is stronger than the Russian ruble, and $100 US. If you saw on the screen, it was like 9,000 rubles. Okay, but that translates to or exchanges to $100 US. Okay, so $103 of groceries, and everyone's shocked about this because I would pay $400 for these groceries in the United States. But he leaves out the fact that the average Russian makes less than $200 a week. So $100 of groceries would be half of their income. So to put it in some perspective, because I think that's an important thing to do, let's actually take a look at some statistics, because I think this is important. He's talking about how Russia is this, look at this grocery store and things are affordable and you see how people live here and it's so wonderful, and maybe it's okay that it's ran by an autocrat dictator who murders his opposition and silences any kind of opposition. Putin is running for president again unopposed because the law can restrict who can run, and they find all these reasons that other people can't run against him, right? And so it's a freaking It's an absolutely authoritarian nightmare. And if you get right outside of these Russian cities, it's abject poverty. And the proof in that would be here in that, like, let's look at how expensive, or look at not just cost of living, but how much do people make. So Russia per capita, this is in US dollars, makes, I should probably zoom in on this if you're watching. Sorry if you're not listening. So Russia, the average, this is like per capita GDP. Okay. So this would be 15,000 about per capita. The United States, 87,000 per capita. Okay. So that is a lot more. That's like 7 times more, the United States per capita. And if we look at the poorest state in the country. So the United States, the poorest state in the country is Mississippi. Mississippi's is, let's see, I'm going to resort these by the lowest. Okay, Mississippi, 49,000, almost 50,000. That is 3x what the average Russian makes. So our poorest citizens in the United States, in Mississippi, make 3 times as much as the average citizen in Russia. I think that's an important point to bring up. So if we're going to talk about the difference between dictatorships and, liberal democracies, and I mean liberal not in the left liberal way, I mean in the free democracies kind of way. Democracies, republic, you know what I mean? When I say democracy, I love that every time I say democracy, people are like, we're not a democracy. I know we're a republic. I get it. Democracy meaning that we get the choice. We get to elect our leaders and vote on laws and things like that, okay? So the poorest Mississippian, that's what we call them, right? They are better off by 3x what a Russian is, especially if you're not an oligarch. Keep in mind their per capita stuff is very, very, very top heavy. Okay. And also, by the way, has Tucker been to a grocery store at all? Like the grocery cart thing. I'm like, have you been to an Aldi? We do that here. That's a thing. That's a thing. Put the quarter in, you get your quarter back at the end of it. It's clear to me that he's not been, which made me think of this clip. So I have got to play this. This is if you are an Arrested Development fan.
I mean, it's 1 banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10?
You've never actually set foot in a supermarket, have you?
I mean, it just made me think of that. Him, like, in the grocery store, I'm like, I think Tucker's probably rich enough that he doesn't ever set foot in a grocery store, and it kind of shows, right? So yeah, $100 for groceries is not that impressive when you start looking at the other economics of Russia. He also had a little clip where he talks about the subways being so beautiful and clean and stuff, and it's like, do you not know the history of the Soviet Union being like, they made Moscow look incredibly clean and well ran, and the trains ran on time, right? That's the classic thing, right? But everything else around it is abject poverty and nothing else works, and it's all corruption. So he's trying to go like, who cares if there's a little bit of corruption? And what I think he's doing is priming the pump for us, because the complaint about Donald Trump that no one can deny is that he has authoritarian tendencies. And I think he would love to be a dictator if he could be. He loves these dictators in these parts of the world because they get to do whatever they want and they don't have to answer to anyone. And I think he wants to be that. And he says it basically, although he says, well, I'm not going to do that. I'll do it on day one or whatever. I think that the media on the right is now preemptively apologizing for Donald Trump potentially doing that and saying it could be good, though. It could be great to have an authoritarian leader or someone that stages a coup to stay in power. It's fine as long as groceries are a little bit cheaper, or if the subway's a little bit cleaner, or like, I don't even know what the point of the McDonald's thing was. Like, look, the fries taste the same. Yeah, it's potatoes boiled or like fried in oil. Those are going to taste good probably anywhere in the world. It's just so weird that he was like, saying the word radicalized, as if going to this grocery store made him go like, I am so angry at our leaders for, like I said, I don't know what. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so what if their McDonald's tastes the same? Who here likes McDonald's? How is that the standard for like, for a thriving economy? We've got McDonald's in third world countries, okay? There are McDonald's everywhere. This is not a just like beacon on a hill kind of situation. If you've got if your fries taste good at your McDonald's, it's not, like I said, it's not McDonald's anymore. It's some, Russian version of, they took over all the husks of the previous McDonald's stores when they got out after they invaded Ukraine. So, these are just kind of silly things that I don't think would normally really matter. he might believe what he's saying. He might not. I lead towards the former. I think that he probably does believe it now. I think if you say things enough, you start to believe them. And if you pretend to be someone long enough, you start to be that person. I don't think he can just turn that off. He's been doing it every night for a long time. And I think he actually is being radicalized. I think that his coziness to Putin, his lack of, he asked some sort of tough questions with no pushback on Putin's answers. And Putin just kind of pushed him around. And that brings us perfectly, or actually, sorry, there's one more clip that I gotta say, because after this sort of interview and stuff, he does a press conference thing. I guess it wasn't a press conference. It was some sort of forum or something. And he was asked about, like, why didn't you push back more? Why didn't you ask about him killing his critics or the lack of freedom of speech and things like that? So let's actually listen to that clip.
You didn't talk about freedom of speech in Russia. You did not talk about Navalny, about assassinations, about the restrictions on opposition in the coming elections.
I didn't talk about the things that every other American media outlet talks about.
Why?
Exclusively.
Yes, this
because
is my
those are
question.
covered, and because I have spent my life talking to people who run countries in various countries and have concluded the following: that every leader kills people, including my leader. Every leader kills people. Some kill more than others. Leadership requires killing people, sorry. That's why I wouldn't want to be a leader. That press restriction is universal in the United States. I know because I've lived it. Ask my former, I've had a lot of jobs. And I've done this for 34 years, and I know how it works. And there's more censorship in Russia than there is in the United States, but there's a great deal in the United States.
I think this is such a false equivalency. To compare the two, first of all, to say that there's more censorship in Russia compared to the United States is like saying there's more water in the ocean than in this cup I'm drinking. It's ridiculous. Russia has no freedom of the press whatsoever. All the media is state controlled. And it's not like, this is not censorship like he's talking about. He's talking about CNN sometimes won't run the story that's inconvenient to Joe Biden because they have a liberal bias. That's not censorship from the government. That is a private company network deciding what to put on the air. Now, I don't like that, but it's not censorship. It's not the government. It's not the state telling people what they can and can't say. That's what happens in Russia. And this was a perfect segue for him to say this a couple days before Alexei Navalny died and was assassinated, most likely. He is definitely assassinated. So if you don't know, quick history, Navalny was basically this thorn in the side of Putin and the Russian oligarchy. He tried to run for president in 2018, but he was not allowed for some bogus reason, of course. He would buy parts of Russian companies so he could ask embarrassing questions to the boards who were cozy with the Kremlin and sort of part of that whole oligarchy. And all of this constant poking at the bear got him multiple attempts on his life. So Russia tried to poison him in 2020, and they unsuccessfully tried to poison him. He recovered in a German hospital, and he chose to go back to Russia. He went back voluntarily, knowing he would be arrested and possibly killed, definitely killed eventually, and ends up in a prison camp in north of the Arctic Circle. This is like in the middle of nowhere, the frozen tundra of the Arctic. This is 1,000 miles north of Moscow. And that's where he died. And they claim that he went for a walk and he fell ill and just died. And no one believes this, of course. He was assassinated. And I'm not going to theorize why it happened last week. I don't think it's a coincidence. And I'm not saying it necessarily has to do with Tucker, but I don't think, first of all, Putin does this all the time. He kills anyone. All sorts of people die mysteriously in Russia, some of which are, we saw that coming. Like we just happened again with, the general that I'm totally drawing a blank on, but died in a plane crash. Wow, mysteriously after kind of almost staging a coup against Putin, and then all of a sudden he dies a few months later. It's like this is a common thing that happens every time. But here's what I do know. This prison is in the middle of nowhere. In fact, it's so in the middle of nowhere that Navalny's lawyers and family did not know where he had been moved to because he was in one prison, and then he wasn't there anymore, and they couldn't find him. So if Putin would not, sorry, let me start over. We would not know that Navalny had died unless Putin wanted us to know that. They could have kept that a secret. They chose to release that information. I think that this has to do with maybe a little bit of Tucker, certainly about the Ukraine war. It certainly has to do with geopolitical stuff. This is Putin's strategy. I don't know why. I don't know if it could be just because this presidential election is coming up and he just wants to remind people what happens to you if you choose to speak out against him. I don't know. But the point is, it was purposeful. And it certainly makes Tucker look like an ass, right? Because here a couple days before, he says, leaders kill people. That's what they do. My leader kills people. So does Putin. And he makes the distinction. What really bothers me about that quote is that he equates the two as if Joe Biden is just assassinating Americans all the time. In fact, as if any American president is assassinating Americans. I don't know of any American citizen that Joe Biden has assassinated. I also don't know of any American citizen that Donald Trump assassinated or George W. Bush assassinated, or you pick him. Now, Obama, one exception, because he did drone an American citizen who was working with Al-Qaeda on purpose. I would call that an assassination. I think that was illegal. I don't think that was okay for Obama to do, just like I don't think it would be okay for any sitting president to assassinate a United States citizen, because it doesn't happen. Yes, Joe Biden calls for strikes on Houthi rebels and they die because they attacked our ships and they murdered 3 of our U.S. soldiers. That is a difference, though, that's a difference in kind of killing as opposed to numbers. Tucker tried to say, oh, well, some kill more than others. It's kind of going back to the corruption thing or to the censorship. It's like, well, some censor more than others. Some kill more than others. It's a totally different kind of killing. Killing your political opposition is not the same as killing Houthi rebels or, pick your strike, pick your situation that the president of the United States has to pick up or any leader of any country has to. There are military operations, obviously, when they're commander in chief. And yes, lives will be lost. You are making that choice as the president. It's not the same thing, though. And to equivocate them at all is... he knows that's wrong. And that's what bothers me is that he goes, well, I'm just asking questions. And the reason I didn't push back and ask him more hard questions is because everyone else does that anyway. I don't want to cover what everyone else does. Everyone else talks about how Russia's corrupt, so I'm not going to talk about the corruption. To me, that's a cop-out, and I don't like it at all. So, this is a quote from, let's see, where did I put that? I don't remember where it went. Anyway, there's a good quote. I'll try to pull it up. Where did it go? Let's see here. Hold on. There was a good article in National Review that talked about this well, and it was from Jeffrey Blahar. It said the article was called "We Need to Talk About Tucker." Understand Carlson's rhetorical sleight of hand here. He later characterized Navalny's assassination as horrifying, barbaric, and awful. No decent person would defend it. In fact, Carlson's fans would argue that he wasn't defending it in his Dubai comments either, and that his denunciation of the killing was logically consistent with the position he took there. But that's not the trick. The trick is that by conflating Vladimir Putin with the leaders of Western nations, including the President of the United States, he is casually averring that they are functionally equivalent. Some kill more than others clearly indicates that the difference to Carlson is one of number and not kind. Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm trying to say, is that for him to put them on the same level and say that, hey, all of our leaders do bad things. All of our leaders have to kill people. To me, it's just not the same thing. It's just not at all. And of course, Trump could not help himself but jump into this discourse, of course. He's got... all these legal problems and whatnot stacking up, being that he's been indicted on multiple charges and whatnot. And yet, of course, the thing that he's going to say is that, well, I'm like Navalny because I'm being politically persecuted by my enemies. And so his quote was, the sudden death of Alexei Navalny has made me more and more aware of what is happening in our country. It is a slow, steady progression with crooked, radical left politicians, prosecutors, and judges leading us down a path to destruction, open borders, rigged elections, and grossly unfair courtroom to blah, 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 blah. Okay. He's saying he's Navalny, the guy that dodged the draft during the Vietnam War, is trying to claim that he's the same kind of political prisoner or victim. First of all, the bravery aspect alone that Navalny went back to Russia knowing he would be imprisoned and killed is crazy to me because I love this country. I would do a lot to make it better. But I don't know if I had safely escaped persecution in my country that I would go back to it knowing that I would be put in jail or murdered. I don't know that I would. I cannot say that I would do that, especially with a family. And this is a guy that did that. And for Trump to compare him, that's all he said. He didn't say it was bad. He didn't say this is barbaric. We shouldn't allow countries to do this to their opposition. He didn't say any of that. He just turned it into a look at me. I'm the victim here. It's absolutely crazy to me, right? Others on the right chimed in on this too, including like Dinesh D'Souza. And he said the plan of the Biden regime and the Democrats is to ensure their leading political opponent dies in prison. There's no real difference between the two cases. Well, there's a pretty big difference between the two cases. Joe Biden's Justice Department is not indicting Trump because he's his political opposition. He's doing so because he committed actual crimes. Now, do I think there's some problems with the way, like the New York yes, we've talked about this. The New York indictments against Trump are bogus and they shouldn't even stand. They should have never been. They're purely political. They would never go after anyone else except for Donald Trump for this crime. And in fact, Alvin Bragg, the DA there, has specifically lowered charges for very serious violent crimes against people because he thinks that it will, create real justice and stuff. So he's actually minimizing crimes normally, but he's maximizing the one against Trump. It's clearly political, but like the documents case, I do not think is clearly political. And Joe Biden is not jailing anyone in this country for having an opinion. Like I can right now talk trash on Joe Biden with zero repercussions. You cannot do that in Russia. The people that showed any sort of condolences, put flowers out, or any sort of public display of support of Navalny after his death, they've been arrested by the hundreds. They've been beaten up. Like there's a strong police force against even appearing to support the guy that was opposed to Putin. That is not happening in this country. And to pretend otherwise is wrong. And the right is so infested with these creeps that are doing this stuff that it really makes me mad because that is not this country. And it's super logically inconsistent because they praise Putin, but then they say what he did to Navalny was horrifying, barbaric, and awful. That was Tucker's quote. So what is it? Is it awful? Or is it not? Or are you just saying, yeah, it's awful, but it's part of doing business, and if it gets us cheaper groceries, we're okay with it? That's pretty gross. It's also there's really no connection there between those two things. The reason the city is clean is, because they crack down on any kind of opposition stuff, but they can keep one little part of town clean. But like that doesn't mean the whole country is being ran well. And the truth is they have to pretend they want a strong man. And Putin's their strongman that they get to support because Donald Trump connected himself to Putin for some reason. I really don't think it has as much. I think it's a combination of two things. First, it's that he just likes strongmen. He kind of like loved to cozy up to Putin. He loved to kind of do the same thing with Kim Jong-un. He's into these dictators because he wants to be that, I think, generally. And then I think the other problem with Russia specifically is that he's mad at Ukraine because, he was trying to get Ukraine to sell out Joe Biden for stuff in the 2020 election, and he got impeached for it. And I think that there's a bitterness towards Ukraine that also helps him want to support Russia in this thing. And so that poison has filtered down to all of the GOP now. And you've got half the GOP saying we shouldn't fund Ukraine, which we'll talk about in a second. And you've also got a bunch of people making excuses for murdering political opposition right there. And I just think it's really, really bad. And, to say that Joe Biden's Justice Department has been flawless or Obama's before his, no, I think the Justice Department needs to be cleaned out. I think that the FBI has been specifically bad at their jobs for the last while. There was some really gross stuff that went on after the 2016 election and those people were fired, but they weren't like really punished. They still have jobs and they have like cushy cable news commentary jobs and stuff. For saying, hey, we'll make sure he doesn't get into office. That's not the FBI's job. And the Russiagate investigation was a nightmare. It was not it was based on nothing. And it was, not quite a witch hunt, but Trump wasn't totally wrong in calling it as such. It really kind of was. And, I think this clip, so if you hadn't heard, obviously, Jon Stewart is back at The Daily Show, I guess once a week or something. Of course, I think I have a lot of problems with Jon Stewart too, but he did sum this up nicely on how this works. Here's that clip.
Perhaps if your handlers had allowed, you would have seen there is a hidden fee to your cheap groceries and orderly streets. Ask Alexei Navalny or any of his supporters.
In Vladimir Putin's Russia, political repression is everywhere. And hundreds have been arrested for daring to honor Navalny so publicly.
Right. Because the difference between our urinal-caked, chaotic subways and your candelabred, beautiful subways is the literal price of freedom.
Yeah. I mean, he's not wrong. You should watch that whole thing. It's pretty funny, actually. It does a better job of eviscerating Tucker for all this than I would do. He's a comedian. Obviously, I'm not. But I really think all this boils down to being un-American. Or not un-American, it's anti-American. It's equating America with Russia and saying we're both bad, so we might as well have a dictator. And it's not fair to take the same things that are happening in Russia and say, well, that also happens here. Well, they're censoring stuff, so are we. They murder people, so do we. They have poverty, so do we. And they're not looking at the actual details of any of that. And to me, it's plainly anti-American. And you even look at Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," implies that the country's not great. So now we have two parties who, for the most part, the bases of them feel that they're anti-American. The left, I think, is pretty obviously anti-American and on the far fringes of the progressive movement. And they have been since the 60s. This is nothing new. This is an exact flip almost, except that the left hasn't changed that much. But, during the Cold War in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the progressive left were the ones that were communist sympathizers. They were the ones sympathizing with Russia. They were the ones buying into the propaganda. This was a classic thing that the Russian government did, or not from the Russian, I guess the Soviet Union did, was communists would use these sort of journalists that were sympathetic to the cause, sympathetic to communism and stuff, and they would dupe them into, because basically when you have a bias, you're going to look for the answer to that bias. And so I think the famous story, I can't remember who the writer was, but in Cuba, he went to Cuba during the communist dictatorship, and of course there was all the Cuban Missile Crisis, all that kind of scary stuff of having a Russia-supported communist state right outside of the edge of Florida. And he went and they specifically, what they did is like march the same small group of soldiers, but sort of around him over and over again. And so he thought it was one gigantic crew and he thought they had this massive army. And he went back and wrote that, like, they've got this fierce army and all this stuff. And it was literally like an optical illusion. He fell for it and wrote about it and all this stuff. And so the communists use this kind of stuff. This is a classic trope. It's like, it's using sympathetic journalists as propaganda. And I think that's what Putin kind of successfully did with Tucker here. And it's just weird that, to me, it's switched, because it used to be the left that felt this way. And I think it still is the left that kind of feels this way. It's just now it's switched to, instead of it being about communism versus capitalism, although there's still certainly an anti-capitalistic string of the left, but it's become about these racist institutions in America. And so they're saying America is inherently racist, or the 1619 Project is trying to say we are a racist country and you can't fix that without reparations, or, basically doing new racism. It's like you've got to prefer minorities and stuff. And I think that stuff's crazy, but it's anti-American, and so is the new right. The new right is saying America's not great, so let's make it great again. They're saying, I literally argue with people on the internet, which is foolish of me. I understand. But there are people that if you ask them, well, what if Trump wants to be a dictator? What if he never leaves office? People are like, I'm fine with that. I'd be okay with him being a dictator, because they can't think past. They cannot think past their guy not being in power anymore. And they think, yeah, sure, I'll give my guy or my party all of the free reign to do whatever they want. I don't want them to have any checks and balances. I just want the other side to have checks and balances. And no one ever seems to realize that when you break a norm on your side, the other side's going to do it too. It gives them permission to say, well, they did it, and so we're going to do it too. All of this is anti-American. And what are we going to do if we have two countries that are anti-American? How does that benefit us as a country? I don't know. And I don't have a good answer for this. I'm asking questions that I don't have the answer to. And but it worries me because if Tucker is the most, I mean, maybe not now, but he certainly was one of the more influential, opinion. I mean, he claims to be a journalist, but whatever. We blur that line too much with news and stuff now. But if he's one of those sort of thought leaders of new right media and he's plainly anti-American, that's on the right. And then we've got that on the left too. I don't see how that doesn't filter down and cause major problems when everyone in the country is going like, we should just burn all the institutions down. We should start, the Constitution is racist, or this is racist, or this is, I don't know what the right's problem even is, other than, I get their complaints. I get Tucker's complaints about cities specifically. Yeah, the New York subway system is kind of gross. And has a lot of problems. And there's certainly a lot of corruption and the way that city's ran. And yeah, it's ran by Democrats. Most of these big cities are. And it would be nice if we said, you know what, maybe we should give someone else a try. I think that it would be interesting to see what actual conservatives and Republicans would do, get out of the shadow of Trump, because you could do that in a city. How would they run a city? Because most cities are not ran by Republicans. They're ran by Democrats, and they have been for decades. And that's where some of this rot is. But to pretend that it's all like corruption and stuff, there is certainly corruption, and I think the government is bad at doing a lot of things, but ineptitude and, sort of applying a malfeasance to this is just, they're not the same thing. And I think that that's a problem. So that's the Russia stuff, but it doesn't stop there, because we can't keep talking about Russia without talking about Ukraine, right? And so just quick update on Ukraine, because I think it's worth noting. So, James Langford's bill that was supposed to have border security and Ukraine funding and Taiwan funding and Israel funding was dead on arrival. It didn't ever get taken up for a vote, and that sucked. So senators started working on one that didn't have the border stuff. So, okay, let's just talk about the aid to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan and stuff. They passed something with 70 votes in the Senate for funding. And Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has said, we're not going to do it. And we're not going to take it to a vote. And so there's really only one way that can happen now. So what basically there's a weird thing called, it's a procedural thing called a discharge petition. And so like half the House has to vote to bring it to the floor, and they can do so. So this might still pass because there are enough people that would support it. It's just weird because there's kind of a fringe on the GOP side that doesn't want to support Ukraine. There's also a fringe on the left that doesn't want to support Israel. So combining them together is supposed to get the support of the bulk of the people, but there's still some fringy people that, unfortunately, because of the way it works in Congress, they have a lot of power right now. So you're talking about a couple dozen people having control over all this aid. The reason this bothers me so much, and I think this is worth explaining because I've not done it on the show before, but I think that we should support Ukraine. I'm fine with having discussions of like, what are the goals? Like, what is the end game here? What's their plan to win this war? What do we think the realistic expectations of what will happen in the future are? That is all fine to have, but I think we need to support them because we signed an agreement with them in the 90s. And so this is the Budapest memorandum I think it was 94, I'm pretty sure. And in exchange for Ukraine, who was a newly independent nation, to relinquish all their nuclear weapons, because they had like inherited nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union when they broke off to be their own independent nation. And we were trying to get fewer countries with nuclear weapons. We thought that would be a safer world in general. And so we said, hey, if you relinquish your nuclear weapons, we in Russia and the UK will pledge to respect your territorial integrity and sovereignty. And we won't let you, this will be your country. We will protect it. And we basically said, we will protect you if someone invades you. That's what we were saying. Russia obviously broke its end of the deal through most of the 21st century, and now very obviously by invading Ukraine and starting a war there. But we're not holding up our end either, because we said, look, if you get rid of your nuclear weapons, which would be a deterrent for Russia to invade you in the future, we will protect you, and we will say this nation is sovereign and your borders are sovereign. If someone invades you, we'll help you out. We're not holding up our end of the deal. So I think that we should. I think that when we make promises, we should keep them. That's just my general opinion of all life, but definitely when a country says, hey, if you get rid of your best way to deter your neighbor from invading you, we will protect you in that case, and we will supply you with weapons and stuff. And we're not doing it. So I think plainly with that only in mind, that's the reason we should support Ukraine. Now, we can talk about the details. We can talk about dollar amounts. We can talk about, first of all, we don't just give them money. We're giving them weapons. So all of that money that we pass and that spending, it's going to U.S. defense contractors. This is not, very little of the money is actually just going to like foreign aid. And I think we should keep track of it because there is absolutely corruption in Ukraine. I want to make sure that we're not lining the pockets of some specific people in Ukraine. I want to make sure we're helping that effort for them to push back Russia. There should be a goal in mind, but we have to support them. And Congress is dragging their feet. And I think it's going to hurt the GOP that they're going to get blamed for this, I think, in November. And I think that's going to lose them the House and the Senate. That's what I think will probably happen. So, and you know what? Honestly, Biden is not without I need to spend some time talking about Biden because he's abjectly terrible at this. He's been slow rolling the support. So even when we had the funding, Ukraine would say, we need this kind of missile. He'd be like, I don't know. I don't know if we should give that to you. And he'd wait like 6 months. We need fighter jets. I don't know. Maybe we should wait. Or we need cluster bombs. Whatever they were asking for, we slow rolled giving it to them. So we were never giving them what they needed when they needed it. We were going, let's wait and see. And I don't like that Biden was doing that either. I think that's been bad for the war effort in general. And now Congress is doing that too. So Biden was already kind of tying one hand behind their back. And now Congress has tied both hands behind their back. And I think it's going to end badly. I think that the last few months have not gone well for Ukraine. And they put up a bigger fight than anyone thought they could. We're 2 years into this thing, but it's not enough. It won't be enough if we don't keep supporting them. So I think we should. And despite the majority of support inside of Congress, we can't seem to get it done because of a few plucky members that are trying to support Trump because Trump says he's anti-Ukraine. So now some of those GOPers have to follow suit. And we're not making any decisions based on actual geopolitical strategy. It's just based on, the guy at the top of the ticket that's going to make my life hell if I speak out against him. And that's not leadership. There's really nothing. There's no leadership in that. But it doesn't end there because then we get, like I said, this was you couldn't have scripted this week as far as how much it intersects with Russia. So, on a normal week, I probably wouldn't even talk about this, but because I don't think we know enough yet. But there was the Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee came out and said, basically sort of behind closed doors first, but then he had a press conference. He basically came out and said, hey, Biden, you should declassify all the info pertaining to a possible threat of nuclear weapons in space launched by the Russians. And it seemed like he was making like a really big deal about this, saying, hey, we need to know about this information. White House comes out and says, they do think Russia is working to develop the ability to detonate a nuclear weapon in space for the purpose of taking out commercial satellites, but that they don't have that capability yet. And that's sort of what they implied. Russia denies this. They say they're not doing any such thing, but of course we can't believe anything Russia is saying again. So, that's another scary thing because we've got the potential. There was a 1967 accord that we signed that says, I didn't even know this thing existed until this week, but we specifically said, hey, we will not launch nuclear weapons in space. We had done a test in the 60s where we launched we detonated a nuclear weapon like 250 miles above the Earth in space to see like what would happen. And it was really bad. It took out not only satellite. First of all, there weren't that many satellites in the air in the 1960s when they did this test. I think this was in 64. Don't quote me on that. But there weren't that many nuclear weapons, or not nuclear weapons. There weren't that many satellites in space, but the ones that were there got destroyed not by the blast. It's not the blast that actually does the destroying. It's actually that sends out such a massive radiation and it's like an EMP. Like you remember in Ocean's 11, the gag where they blow up the thing and it's like a bomb without the bomb. It just like kills every electronic device. That essentially happens in space. And while our military satellites are protected against the radiation damaging them like that, our commercial ones are not. And that's the vast majority of the satellites that are up in space. So what this sounds like is a desperate Russia plan to, if all else failed, they could launch a nuke into space, take out tons of communication satellites for lots of different countries, and it would really disrupt things like banking, cellular service, internet, all sorts of things that we rely on every day. You don't realize how many things are connected to satellites that you use every single day. But that's kind of the idea. And we kind of proved that this would happen, because in the 1960s when we did it, the results of it were way worse than we thought they were going to be. And that's why we signed this thing in 1967 between us and Russia. And maybe there were other countries too that just said, we will not explode things in space. It's a bad idea. Obviously, Russia does not always hold up their end of the bargain on these sort of treaties or agreements. So we'll see what happens there. So far, it doesn't look like it's actually a credible threat for right this very moment, but it's at least the reason it's important to think about is because these are Putin and Russia's plans. These are the kind of things they're planning for, and at least using them as contingencies. And they are the kind of things that I hope Congress is worried about, and the serious kind of stuff that I would expect the House Intelligence Committee to be working on and protecting us against. But I'm not sure that we will have any serious people left in Congress after this year. Every serious politician that I've seen, most of them are retiring or quitting. They can't put up with it anymore. They don't want to be in the party where if they say anything that goes against Donald Trump, even if it's just a policy thing, they're going to get crucified for it. And so, there's one more thing. And then the last thing that happens is that you may have heard this a couple years ago, there was an FBI informant who made an allegation against Joe and Hunter Biden that they were accepting bribes. And it was later discredited, and that guy has been arrested now because he admitted that the officials associated with Russian intelligence were involved in the passing of that bribery story to the FBI. So this guy essentially got it from, it's like a guy that knows a guy and basically was working for Russian intelligence. So this was a Russian op. And look, I don't know that we needed the Russian op to tell us that Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and the Biden family are corrupt. I think it's pretty clear from everything we know so far that they're absolutely corrupt. I don't know if Joe Biden did anything that raises to the level of being illegal yet. I haven't seen the evidence that that's the case. Sounds like some of this stuff was going on while he was not vice president. But if he took money from foreign countries, and honestly, even if he knew, we know he knew Hunter was accepting money from foreign countries for influence peddling. The fact that he allowed that to happen with his brother and his son, to me, that's corruption. You are letting people buy access to you, and you're allowing it to happen, which means that you are essentially saying, it works. I'm fine with it if it means my son makes money. That's corruption, I think. I think it's gross, and I would prefer not to have it. And I hope that this drip, drip, drip of this information, I think, has been good for Republicans in the sense that I think people are losing faith that Biden, most people will now describe, if you look at polls, they describe him as being corrupt. They think that there's a there. There might not be a smoking gun yet, but it's like there's enough smoke that we think there's a fire. And so, we know that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. We know it didn't actually affect things, but they tried to meddle in the 2016 election. We also know they tried to meddle in the 2020 election, not only through this sort of FBI informant trying to do these bribery allegations against Joe Biden and his son, but we know, so why would they not do it again? They're going to do it this year. You are going to hear Russian disinformation in 2024. I promise you. You probably already are. We've already seen it. So keep that in mind as you hear things this year. If it sounds too good to be true, it might be. And look, I think Joe Biden is absolutely corrupt. I think Donald Trump is corrupt. I cannot believe that we're going to go into another election year with these two guys, but it's probably going to happen. And so that's what we're going to have to deal with. And obviously Putin has a preference on those two. He would prefer Trump being there. And now what's kind of weird about that is that Trump's administration was harder on Russia than Obama's was. So I'm not really sure why he wants Trump in there. I think he didn't want Hillary in there for sure. And maybe he does want Joe. I think he wants chaos. I think he wants the United States citizens to not have faith in their election system. And I think the things that they've been doing to sow those seeds of doubt have been working. So if you're keeping score, Russia's kind of winning at this game. Even if they didn't change a single vote in 2016, they are sowing the discourse. They are sowing the lack of faith in elections. And I think that's as big of a problem as we can have, because it's just gotten worse. In 2016, it was the Democrats claiming the election was stolen. In 2020, it was the Republicans claiming the election was stolen. And in 2024, I promise you, one of the two sides will claim the election was stolen. Because if Trump loses, he'll say the election was stolen. And I honestly think that the people on the left will do the same thing if Trump wins. They'll say that somehow they'll do the same thing. And I think that is eroding our trust in not only our institutions, but our election systems. And that bothers me. So I'll leave it there. Please follow along on Instagram and YouTube where I post shorter content, and feel free to jump in the comments and tell me your thoughts and what you want to hear about in future episodes. As always, it really helps me if you share The Homeless Conservative with someone you think might enjoy it, as well as rate the show on Apple or Spotify. I really appreciate you taking time to listen. I know you have so many things competing for your attention, and so I really appreciate that you let me have a little bit of it. So I'll see you next time.